Good evening, everybody. Welcome. This is not, maybe this is too much. So let me first introduce the speaker of today's talk, Professor Guido Sandleris, who's a colleague here at Johns Hopkins SAIS Europe, and he's also professor of economics at Torquato di Tella, Argentina, where he has also served as dean of the business school. Professor Sandleris has degrees from University of Buenos Aires, London School of Economics, and he got a PhD in economics from Columbia University. And he has worked for several international organizations, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and several Latin American governments. And he has a lot of policy experience. He has had several appointments in the Argentinian government. Most notably, he was governor of the Central Bank of Argentina in September 2018, December 2019. And his academic research focuses on the effect of financial crisis and the cost of sovereign defaults. He has published on these topics in various journals, like the Journal of International Economics, the Journal of Monetary Economics, the Journal of Money, Credit and Banking, Oxford University Press. So I'm delighted to introduce you to Professor Sandleris, who will be talking about Milei, newly elected president of Argentina, and whether this time is different. Just a couple of words. Of course, you all know that the newly elected president of Argentina is a controversial figure, to say the least, both from a non-economic and generally political point of view. So why don't I leave the floor to Professor Sandleris, and then you will have a chance to ask questions after his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ana Maria, for your introduction. Thank you all for being here. I know we are almost at the spring break. You are past the midterms. So it's hard to be here. I value it double. So there has been a lot of interest, I would say, globally about Milei. He's a different political leader. And once again, it looks like Argentina is starting to travel a different path from the one we have been seeing in recent years. So what I will try to answer in this talk is whether will he be successful or not? Is going to be this time different for Argentina or not? So basically, the presentation is divided in 4 parts. First, I will try to give you some perspective on the Argentine economy, then talk a little bit about Milei himself. It's been 100 days since he took office, so I'm going to try to do a balance of his first 100 days in office on the economic front, what he's trying to achieve, and whether looking forward, whether he's going to be successful or not. So some perspective. This table shows the last 50 years of GDP per capita real growth rates in Argentina and the other countries in South America. So I would say Latin America, including Mexico. And you have there the growth rate by decades and overall the average growth rate for the last 53 years. One thing that becomes clear when you look at the first column is that Argentina has not been doing well. The worst performer in the region is Venezuela, with an average growth rate of negative 0.2% in these last 53 years. Venezuela is a special case. It has suffered under Chavismo the largest decline in GDP by a country that is not suffering a war. in the world in history. And the second worst performer in the region is Argentina, with positive 0.6% growth in real GDP throughout these 53 years. And when you look at, I'm going to add something else. So Argentina has been one of the worst performers in a region of the world that has not done spectacularly well. Okay, if we divide the world in regions, probably Latin America is one of the regions of the world that has grown the least in these last 50 years. So we did poorly in a region of the world that did poorly. So we are one of the worst performance in terms of growth in a region that didn't do well. And when you look at the data per decade, it's arbitrary to divide it by decades. Like, I mean, it might make more sense to look at different economic programs or approach to how to handle the economy, but it gives us some intuition of what was going on in different periods. What we see is that if you take away the 90s, basically Argentina has been the worst, one of the worst performers consistently in terms of economic activity in the region. Now, the other typical variable that one looks at when trying to assess how well an economy is doing is, well, we look at economic activity or GDP growth or GDP per capita growth, and we also look at inflation, okay, as a measure of stability. When you look at inflation, well, it's been as awful, if not even worse, than the GDP performance. A 50-year-old Argentine like me basically has lived 4/5 of his life with inflation running at 20% per year or above. In the graph, there are 3 peaks that I had to cut because otherwise the rest of the numbers would look like just undistinguishable, which is the hyperinflations of 76, 85, and March 90. No? March 90 is the real, is the big, between 89 and 1990, 1991. We had like a huge hyperinflation with inflation running in March 1990 at 20,000% per month. Okay, insane numbers. But the fact that we have these 20,000 doesn't mean that our inflation last year, which was 211%, is normal. Most countries in the world have gotten used to live with low inflation. Argentina did not. And when you combine both things, so looking at years where Argentina had growth and low inflation over the last 53 years, you see that, or 54 years, you see that it has not happened often in Argentina. Of the last 54 years, the economy spent 22 years in a recession, 39 with inflation running at 20% or higher. And there is this thing that most countries in the world achieve every single year, which is to grow a little bit and to have inflation below 10%. Okay, that's the normal. Argentina managed to do it only 8 times in the last 54 years. What is normal for most countries, we had it only 8 times, 8 years in the last 54 years. And the last time was like 20 years ago. And when I say that it's a normal, if you look at Germany in the last 54 years, had like over 40 of those years with that combination. Australia had almost 50 of those 54. You look at the countries in the region, and the same thing happens. They managed to achieve some growth and low inflation every single year. So clearly, by looking at this data, it's obvious that something is going on with the Argentine economy. It's not going well, and it's not a phenomenon that you can say, well, it's these last 4 years or the previous one or 8 years before. It's been kind of systematic. Something is not working. And any economic phenomena that you look at has multiple causes, okay? But sometimes it makes sense to say, okay, there are many reasons, but if I have to pinpoint what has been the Achilles heel of the Argentine economy, I would say that the presence of systematic fiscal deficits that couldn't be genuinely financed has been one of the key problems of the Argentine economy over this period. What do I mean by genuinely financed? You can have a fiscal deficit if there are lenders willing to lend you consistently. That is not the case in Argentina for two reasons. One, the domestic credit market is shallow, and systematic defaults has and depreciation of the currency and high inflation means that domestic lenders are not that willing to lend to the government. And the same happens with foreign lenders. They are there for a short period of time, but then they get worried that Argentina might default, so they stop lending. So if you don't have a consistent source of lending, you cannot run consistent fiscal deficits. And Argentina had only 6 years with overall fiscal surplus. And if we look closely at those 6 years, part of the surplus is due to postponing pension payments that then the Supreme Court said that they had to be paid. So we have a government that has systematically overspent. And the situation, having fiscal deficit, got worse in recent years. If you look at these 54 years, you see that public spending in terms of GDP was more or less constant around 22, 23% of GDP since the 70s until 20 years ago. In 2003, the Peronist Party, now under former President Néstor Kirchner and then his wife, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, took office for 12 years. And between 2003 and 2015, public spending in terms of GDP almost doubled. It went from that 23% average to more than 41% in 2015. So now, public spending, the government has become pretty big in terms of the size of the economy. And it has become a very heavy backpack for the private sector to carry. With higher public spending came higher taxes, but they weren't enough to generate a surplus. And those higher taxes mean that few investments are really attractive in the country. And therefore, with few investment, you have little capital accumulation and little growth. And that's basically our story of the recent decades. Of course, not all governments are equal. If you see, in 2015, President Macri took office. I was part of that administration. We have this diagnosis that a key element, if we wanted to change the recent economic history of Argentina, a key element was to decrease public spending. We tried to do so. Public spending in terms of GDP went from 41% to 35% in 2019. But of course, something that you all know, and it's going to be a subject that we will touch again when we talk about Milei, is that while increasing public spending makes you popular, cutting public spending makes you unpopular. So governments that try to cut public spending have sometimes a hard time in terms of maintaining their popular support. So President Macri in 2019 was not reelected, and then again, Peronismo won the election, this time with Alberto Fernández as president and former President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner as vice president, and once again, public spending rose. So the other factor that I would say, so key element for this very poor economic performance, I say the first one was this fiscal imbalance. The other thing is that maybe surprisingly, Argentina is a very closed economy. Usually you measure how open or closed an economy is by looking at how much it trades with the rest of the world. Exports plus imports over GDP. These are all countries in the world. In blue or in light blue, you have Argentina. Argentina is the third most closed economy in the world. It's an economy that trades very little with the rest of the world. and it has consistently been so. So that's the perspective, okay? And then we have a new president. So first, now that was background on the Argentine economy. Let's talk a little bit about the political system, okay? Quick. So Argentina, since 1983, is living in a democratic system. Since then, the Peronist Party, under different formulations, has been in office in 70% of the time, approximately. The exceptions were Alfonsín in the first 6 years of democracy, then a brief 2-year period of another moderate president, De la Rúa. Both of them belong to, this is one of the puzzling things of Argentina, to a party called Unión Cívica Radical, like the Radical Party, which is nothing radical, is like a center. It would be a social democrat or something like that. So they were in office. And then we have consecutive Peronists in office until in yellow we have those 4 years of Mauricio Macri. And an important point is that Macri was the first president of Argentina elected democratically that managed to finish his term since Peronismo exists. Peronismo was born in 1945 when Juan Perón, a military, became elected president. Okay, so since 1945 until the present, there has been only one president that managed to finish its term, which was Mauricio Macri. But he didn't manage to be reelected. And now, Argentina has chosen an outsider to lead our country, Javier Milei. The first picture is probably one of the ones that made him famous with the, what's the name of that thing? The chainsaw. So he said, basically, yeah, there it is. Basically, this is a guy who, until he was an economist, working in the private sector, and until, I would say, 10 years ago or 12 years ago, was not famous at all. And then he started going to TV shows as a panelist, and he was very successful, in part because he would get very upset and defend his ideas, sometimes with violent words, like he was a libertarian in a context in which the party in government, not Macri, but the Peronist Party, was more of a state intervention, regulations, and he was advocating the opposite. And he became popular going to TV shows, and he campaigned for the presidency on 4 concepts. The first one was freedom. His party is called La Libertad Avanza, freedom advances. Freedom in opposition as all the restrictions that were there during the pandemic. Argentina was one of the countries that had more restrictions during the pandemic. It didn't mean that we got less deaths, but we got lots of restrictions. So freedom was an issue that was relevant for people. The second key concept was the caste. Basically, if you listen to him, he would say, he would show some numbers or talk about some numbers similar to the one I showed at the beginning, saying, look, this has been a disaster in terms of growth, in terms of inflation. And the people you have to blame, he would say, is the caste. What is the caste? The politicians that are over you. Okay, it gave people like sometimes someone to blame for the failures of our economy. The third element, similar diagnosis in a sense to the one I was presenting, is this change of saying, if we want to grow again, we need to apply a change to government spending. It has gone crazy. Government spending, we need to cut government spending. And he would campaign with the chainsaw going everywhere with that. And the fourth element was dollarization. Inflation was and it's still running very high. And he said this is because basically corrupt politicians are trying to maintain their privileges, spending a lot, and they cannot finance it. So they use the central bank to finance it by printing money that is like just paper. And if we take the ability of the politicians to print money to finance expenditures by dollarizing the economy, then we would be better off. That was his campaign, consistent on that, on those four messages, and he won. And he became, that's from the night he was elected president. 3 years ago, Milei was not participating in politics. In 2021 was his first experience. He ran for Congress. He obtained 17% of the votes in the city of Buenos Aires, not in the country. Then last year, he was the most voted candidate in the primaries. He obtained 30% of the vote. And then our primaries are like a mock general election. Everybody has to vote. So that kind of said that he had a chance to win. Then we had the general elections. He obtained again 30% of the vote. He went on to the runoff with the finance minister of the Peronist party, who was in office, who was the candidate of the party in office. And he won in part because Macri's coalition, Cambiemos, supported to a large extent Milei. So he obtained in the runoff 56% of the vote. And here we are with him as president. He has become this special way in which he talks, defends his ideas, his character, basically has made him a person that has become popular in certain circles. He is able to sometimes to relate to the common man in Argentina in ways that most politicians cannot. He is a person that really sounds authentic when he talks. Doesn't mean that everybody agrees with his ideas in Argentina, but people believe him in the elections and still believe the things he's saying. And this has generated like kind of a following in certain circles. I said, he has established a good relationship with Trump, with Elon Musk, with Giorgia Meloni here in Italy when he came. So this has allowed him to have some global impact beyond what is usually seen in Argentine politicians. Something similar to some extent happened with Macri as well, for different reasons. So what is the big challenge we are going to be talking about? Basically, that he faces is that although he won the presidential elections, he has very little support in Congress. Argentina has 2 chambers of Congress, senators and deputies. He has 7 out of 72 senators and 38 out of 257 deputies who he can claim as his own. And no governors in any of the states that support him. So this is a source of weakness. We are going to see how this plays out. So let's go to the first 100 days. What happened? So first, we talk at the beginning of about I said the Argentine economy in perspective, 50 years, how poorly the Argentine economy has done in these 50 years. Now, let's look at what he got. Like the economy that he received had this history, but in particular was an economy in a desperate situation. As I said, inflation last year was 211%. There were multiple exchange rates, an official and many parallel exchange rates. The gap between the official and the parallel exchange rate was close to 170% when he took office. The fiscal deficit was running at above 5% of GDP, and the central bank has run out of reserves. Reserves were negative in $11 billion. This means that the central bank has basically no firepower to intervene in the market. So the economy was in a crisis when he took office last December. What were the initial economic objectives that he had? Okay, they had to be, what was the urgent thing he had to address? The key thing was to avoid a new hyperinflation. The economy, we had inflation running at 12% per month, not per year. And the risk of this thing exploding. So in order to avoid hyperinflation, and again, inflation was the main concern of people. If you look at polls still today, and you ask what's the main economic problem or what's the main problem in Argentina, people will reasonably answer inflation. So in order to avoid hyperinflation, he had to focus on two things: to reduce the fiscal deficit and to start rebuilding the international reserves of the central bank. And that's what he did. Now, one difference from what happened in the previous 4 years is that when one looks at, as I have been hinting at in these minutes, like his diagnosis of what's happening with what is ailing the Argentine economy is reasonable. This was not the case with the previous administration, who thought that fiscal deficits were fine, that you could spend, as much as you want being in the government, and that this didn't have consequences, that in putting like increasing taxes, putting a lot of restrictions was the way to go. Now we have a new administration, Milei, that in terms of economic policy is trying to point Argentina in the right direction. Again, his views are somehow extreme when you look at the way he reasons. He would argue in favor of markets for everything, basically, which for the world is kind of extreme, but sometimes one has to keep in mind the context in which he's pushing his views. Sometimes he makes it, I think, on purpose, very extreme, because we are coming in from a country in a situation in which we have moved too much towards too many regulations, too large government presence in the economy, too many years of economic failures. So I would say the diagnosis was correct. Trying to avoid hyperinflation was key, and to do so, reducing the fiscal deficit, rebuilding international reserve was key. Let's look at these first 100 days. How well did he do looking at what he tried to do? Well, the central bank has been consistently buying international reserves in these first 100 days. Basically, if we look at just the days where there were markets open, in almost every day, 56 out of the last 58 trading days since he took office, the central bank bought international reserves that were negative in $11 billion when he took office are now negative in $4 billion. That's quite an achievement. You need to have some international reserves to be able to intervene if needed in the FX market. How did he generate this change? We had like months of the central bank selling, and now it is buying. Basically, he combined three things: a very large devaluation of the official exchange rate. So the peso was, while the parallel exchange rate was around 1,000 pesos per dollar, the official exchange rate when he took office was around 400 pesos per dollar. So immediately after taking office, or below 400, he basically generated the value of the official exchange rate to a level close to 830 pesos per dollar. Then he established a special export. There are a lot of capital controls in Argentina, so he modified a little bit what exporters could do to give them more incentive to sell to export goods and sell the dollars they get to the central bank it's called the 80-20 regime. 80% they have to sell at the official exchange rate, 20% at the parallel, and he imposed a new tax on imports of 17% in order to decrease the demand of dollars for imports. That combination improved the international reserves, but of course, the big devaluation generated immediately a big jump in inflation. So the other thing he did was to drastically reduce public spending. In this graph, you see the monthly fiscal result in terms of GDP. You see that they are all red, all deficit. There is small surplus here in 2012. And then, I don't know if you managed to see the two blue. He has managed to achieve 2 consecutive months of fiscal surplus. Of course, sometimes, some days I'm wake up in an optimistic mood and say, this is fantastic. He had this diagnosis and he has been able to very quickly correct the fiscal stance. Some days I wake up less optimistic. I look at how he did it and say, well, will this be sustainable? There were no major reforms that went through Congress. It's just his government like not spending and letting inflation cut a lot of nominal expenditures. What I mean not spending is like pension payments have decreased drastically. Public investment has basically disappeared. He has cut transfer to provinces, all things that are very difficult to maintain over time. You cannot, for example, reduce to almost zero infrastructure investment because roads get holes and you need to repair them. For a while you can do so, but you can not do so forever. Or you cannot let the real value of pensions decrease forever, because at some point people might get upset. And so the way in which he's reducing spending is a way that requires a battle every day to maintain it that way. And that is not going to be easy, and it's been 2 months. It's very good that in 2 months he did well. Will he be able to maintain this over time? We will see. And if we have to think about his fiscal adjustment plan, as I said, the acceleration of inflation plays a key role because that reduces the real value of pension, the real value of many other expenses. And he has reduced transfer to the provinces and increased import taxes. All that managed to lower the fiscal deficit, but at the same time have also affected wages, public wages, but also have worsened a recession that we already had. So less economic activity is creating a decline in wages in real terms. So it's going to be challenging. Inflation, as I said, spiked following the devaluation to 25% per month. In December, 20% in January. Now it went down to 13% per month in February. That has been like hailed as a success in terms of the policy that he's pursuing. The key is at which speed it will go down in the future. No, most expectations are that it will continue to go down, but not at the speed at which we have seen in recent months. Now, in a sense, inflation is coming down to the level that we had prior to the devaluation. So what was the plan to reduce inflation? Recession, basically. Recession plays a key role in reducing inflation, and an anchor for expectation based on 2 main things: the fiscal adjustment and the promise to continue a fiscal adjustment. Without a fiscal deficit, the central bank doesn't need to print money to finance the deficit. So that is an anchor for inflation, and an exchange rate that after the initial devaluation crawls at a relatively slow pace, 2% per month. With inflation running at 15, 12, 10% per month, this means that the real exchange rate is appreciating. Argentina, in dollar terms, with these policies becoming more expensive month after month. So this works to reduce inflation, it does. Now, going forward, what are my concerns? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? So, will Milei's economic plan work to reduce inflation? That's key, because if he managed to control inflation, I think that he will maintain his popular support. And at some point, what we know, what we economists know is at some point, this strong fiscal adjustment, like fiscal surplus, together with very limited monetary expansion as it is happening now, well, that will bring down inflation. We know that it happens. What's the problem? Is that when you are coming from these very high levels of inflation, inflation tends to have a certain inertia. Expectations play a role, and it takes time for inflation to come down. It comes back down easily from the spike, from the 25% to 10%. That if 10% was the previous steady state, let's say. And going even lower, that's hard. And in a sense, the way in which this plan has been put together so far is a way in which what we call the sacrifice ratio is pretty high. What is the sacrifice ratio? Is basically, economists call the sacrifice ratio how much output you are losing to reduce inflation. This plan, where recession is the main anchor and fiscal adjustment, which causes recession, is the promise that keeps everything together. This kind of plan generates a lot of output losses in the short run. And that is tricky. And I think it's tricky. Let me shift to the political front now. I think it's tricky because when you think about most governments in Argentina, and I would argue in the world, in democracies, you have like, when you're in office, you have like two big shields that protect you as president. One is being popular. If people support you, then you have a good chance of continuing being president and pushing forward reforms. The other shield that becomes particularly relevant to push reform forward, but also in times where you are unpopular, is to have a big support in Congress. Sometimes you can be unpopular for a while in presidential regimes, but if you have a lot of support in Congress, you manage to pass that tough period. We know that Milei has very little support in Congress. So one of the shields he does not have. So the only shield that he really has is being popular. And I have just described an economic program that, from all that we know about how people behave, is an economic program that makes you unpopular over time, because it will take time for inflation to come down to levels that are reasonable, because in the process, economic activity will suffer a lot. So it's a program that will damage his popularity. And the risks are huge. The recession is very tough. He needs to do well in the midterm election in order to be able to build his shield in Congress. If he does well in the midterm, he will have more deputies, more senators. So, but a strong recession, inflation being high, the real wages are like at a 20-year minimum. Real pensions are at a 15-year minimum. Poverty is above 45%. Again, it's important, I want to make this clear, I'm not blaming his government for this. This is the result of many years of misguided economic policies by mostly Kirchnerist government, Peronist government. But his policies, to an economy that was already suffering, adds short-term suffering to improving the medium term. Will people support him, or will he have a similar fate as the one Macri had between 2015 and 2019? When I talk to some government officials nowadays and discuss, okay, how can they have better chances to succeed in this, I think that there are two key elements. This is sometimes my message. One is communication. They have been doing an outstanding job so far, both in the campaign and in these first 100 days. Probably the most surprising fact of these first 100 days is that with all the tough measures in terms of the devaluation of people's welfare in the short term, the devaluation, cutting public spending, the recession that the economy is suffering. With all that, Milei's popularity has remained stable. It has not decreased in these first 100 days. And that's a good thing. And part of that is because he's able to communicate pretty well this idea that he's not part of the casta, that all these things that he is doing is because before him there were guys that did things very poor and that had lots of privileges, and that he will take those privileges away. And he communicates in Twitter or X nowadays, and he thinks a lot. The problem is that to push through Congress reforms, he needs to negotiate with these same guys that he's criticized. So there is a dilemma there between how hard he can, or for how long he can have this anti-casta message, and at the same time being able to push through Congress reform. But so far he has been able to maintain his popularity. The second key thing, I think, is economic. If he managed to speed up the reduction in inflation and do so with lower cost in terms of economic activities, he has much higher chances of success. This might seem obvious, no? Because, well, yeah, Guido, if you tell me you can lower inflation easier, it's going to work. The thing is, one of the surprising parts of his plan so far is that it relies too much on this idea that Milei is like, quote unquote, a fiscal crazy president, in the sense that he will forever maintain a fiscal balance, and that allow him to build some credibility on his program. But on the other hand, it has not used any technique, let me call it, any element to try to coordinate expectations in a way that would break the inflation inertia faster and without such a large cost. There are many ways to do so. They are called stabilization plans in economics. In Argentina, we had a couple. They were successful in bringing inflation down for a while. Then, if you don't maintain the fiscal discipline, if you don't do other reforms, they ended up collapsing, like compatibility, the Plan Austral. But we had in Brazil the Plan Real, the way Israel decreased inflation. We have many experiences in the world, showing that there are ways in which you can lower inflation with a lower sacrifice ratio than what his plan seems to be achieving. Now, if stabilization is achieved, I think there is a huge potential for Argentina. The other side of this breach of stabilization for Argentina, for a number of geopolitical and economic reasons, looks good. Argentina is a country with huge natural resources in an area of the world where there is peace that can guarantee for a long period of time, like the supply of gas, oil, agricultural products, in a moment when the world is having trouble doing so. So I think that there is a lot of potential in Argentina. I hope that this government does well, that is able to achieve this stabilization. But I would say that the verdict on whether it will be able to do so or not remains open. I'm going to stop here and let's open for the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm actually going to start with one question. I'm going to take advantage of my position as the moderator and ask the first question, and then I'm going to let you ask all your questions. So in your presentation, you focused, given your background, your professional background, on monetary policy and on economics in particular. But as we know, a presidency comes as a package of both an economic program and non-economic goals. And that's what I was referring to when I said at the beginning that Milei is a controversial figure. I understand your points that the economic program, in light of some indicators, seems reasonable. But I wonder about the other aspects of his political program. And related to that, I wanted to ask you, what are the groups of voters who supported him. So it seems like his economic policy agenda has been able to attract more and more moderate voters. But what is the hardcore of his political base? And is that why he has some extreme political positions on some non-economic issues?
Wow, good question. So in terms of, let me start by the end, the final part. So who his supporters were. So I would say that his true supporters are the 30% that he obtained in the general elections, not the 56% that he obtained in the runoff. I would say that of the 56% that he obtained of votes he obtained in the runoff, 30 are core Milei supporters. We are going to talk in a second for the reasons that they support him. And 26% are more moderate voters that voted for Cambiemos, like that's Mauricio Macri's government, in the general election. So of the 30% that support him, an interesting factor is that they cut across income level, and geographically it's pretty diverse. He managed to make inroads in parts of the country that have been traditionally Peronist strongholds, something that Cambiemos has never been able to do. And when you look at what they share in common, is in general, they tend to be younger voters, more male than female, and frustrated with what I showed at the beginning, economic performance. The two big issues that concern Argentine voters these days and also before the elections were the economy, mostly inflation, and security, crime, okay? So, and he campaigned, I mentioned the chainsaw and dollarization and gave someone to blame for the economic problem. And regarding security, he campaigned on a tough stance, no? Like that there shouldn't be any compromise, that the police should be very tough on crime and so on. So I don't think that the more moderate voters in particular support these more controversial aspects of his views. Sometimes he gets into trouble arguing that at some point during the campaign, he got into trouble because he was arguing that there should be a market for human organs, because he was making the point conceptually of the importance of markets and so on. It doesn't mean that he would take office and then you would be allowed to sell an arm, okay? But of course, those are very controversial issues that are better understood in an academic framework when you are discussing theoretically certain topics than in reality. Since he took office, I would say that on the economic front, but beyond that, to me, he has been pretty pragmatic, more than what I thought so. Okay, let me give you an example. He said, the problem here is government spending. I'm never going to increase taxes because that's a terrible thing to do. And then he realized that to put together a consistent economic plan, it was not enough to cut expenditures. There is no way in which you can cut expenditures enough in just 2-3 months, and that he needed some extra revenues from taxes. So he raised, as I showed, taxes on imports, going against one of his campaign promises, but explaining that, well, this is temporary, this is not what I like, but it's the only way to avoid hyperinflation. So he has been pragmatic, also to some extent on the political front, when he sometimes tries to add the support of certain politicians that one would obviously describe as part of the casta he was blaming before. But there is this tension between this dilemma between the speech that pays off in terms of maintaining popular support against La Casta and the need to get support in Congress. I would sometimes, sometimes I get the impression that if you look at him, he gets into arguments on a weekly basis on a variety of topics and with everybody, from very popular singers to who had, I don't know, there is this very popular singer called Lali, who in Argentina, who said something in X about his policies, and he would come after her. And kind of, everybody was surprised. And part of the thing, in my opinion, what he's trying to do is like, okay, let's discuss other stuff. Let's get people busy and interested in discussions that a little bit distract people away from economic hardship for a while, until the economy starts doing better. I think that that's part of the strategy. Keeping the idea that there is someone else that to blame for the problems and that he's trying to solve the problems and that he's doing stuff to solve the problem, and he's kind of gaining time until his policies have the desired effect on output and on inflation. That's why I said it's key that this happens fast.
Thank you very much.
But let me add something else, because I was thinking about these controversial issues. Then he does things that I don't understand. Like yesterday, it was the anniversary of the military coup in 1976. So it's a day in which human rights activists tend to go out and say that that was a terrible period, and it's true in Argentine history, and that democracy is very important. And he comes out with a video kind of upsetting this crowd. So sometimes it's hard for me, beyond this idea of getting people distracted with discussions about other stuff, it's hard for me sometimes to understand the logic of some stuff that is not economic that he does, beyond this effort to generate topics of discussion.
Thank you very much. So I saw at the very beginning a question way in the back, and then we're going to move forward.
Hello, and thank you so much for your talk, Professor. I had a question regarding this last slide and stabilization and potential for the future. Do you think that were all of his dreams to come true and were the Argentine economy to be stabilized, that it would stay that way due to, as you mentioned, natural resources, peace, et cetera? Or is there a very real possibility that the next Peronist president comes in and just destroys everything again? Just your opinion on the future there.
That's a fantastic question. Yeah, it's been so I was, as you know, part of Macri's administration, and one of the things that is frustrating is that after all the effort of those 4 years, the next administration came in and reversed, for example, we saw in the graph, the decrease in public spending. And I think that that's a key question. There are a lot of things that create the potential for growth, but to be really optimistic on the prospects of the Argentine economy, I think that one of two things need to happen. One is that a government that undertakes the fiscal adjustment, the needed reforms, is able to get reelected. That didn't happen in 2019. Maybe it happens this time. The second alternative, and this is from looking at what happened in countries that suffer similar problems for Argentina, in Brazil, for example. How did Brazil become, from the macroeconomic point of view, a stable country? They have high inflation like we did. And basically, it happened when there was this president, Fernando Enrique Cardoso, who undertook all the adjustments and stabilized the macroeconomy. And then after he was president for like 2 terms, the opposition won. It was Lula, current president, but also president a few years ago. And Lula was like a union leader from the left. And when he was elected president, there was a lot of concern about whether he was going to take back all the reforms that Cardoso has put in place. And Lula did not. He introduced reforms, but on the macroeconomic fronts, he maintained most prudential policies that Cardoso put in place. So one way is like the party in office that introduced the reforms is re-elected. That's the one I mentioned before. The other one is that the opposition starts buying in the reasonable macroeconomic policies. So far in Argentina, we have failed to be able to achieve that because Kirchnerismo, the main party in opposition now, has been reluctant to adhere to these reasonable macroeconomic policies. So it's a big challenge.
Hi, Professor. My question is the following. First, as we know, Argentina, beyond having economic problems, has also like key structural problems like education, labor reforms. So my question will be, how do you believe the government will be able to make changes that are sustainable in time if they don't make any structural changes? As we have seen that, like, for example, the ley omnibus was not being able to pass and doesn't look like Congress will pass any of these reforms.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, it has some points in contact with the previous question in terms of sustainability, but you add one dimension, which is beyond economics. There are so many reforms that are needed. And yes, I'm sympathetic to that. And I would say that those kind of reforms, like how you reform the educational system, to quote your example, is part of the discussion that we see, I would say, in the world and in the region. Part of the reason why the region doesn't grow as fast as it does maybe is related to the educational system we have there. But we are starting so much behind in terms of the discussion. We just need to be normal on the macro front. And then, I'm not saying that this is a sequence, but that then we need to attack all those other fronts. And some things need to be done simultaneously, and it's very difficult if you don't have support in Congress. That's part of the reason why I thought that Cambiemos was a much better option, because they had much more support in Congress, they had experience, like a number of reasons. But it's a big challenge to do so when you have a little support in Congress.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I was curious, you mentioned that Argentina is a kind of closed country, economically speaking, so I was wondering why, and if like trying to open the economy could actually be part of the solution or not.
Yes, I think it would be part of the solution. Yes, definitely. The big issue there is like, with all these reforms, the big issue is how you sequence them. If you open up the economy with an overappreciated real exchange rate, you might generate a huge negative impact very quickly on employment, which might make things worse in the short run in terms of popular support for the reforms. So sequencing is key on these things, but definitely I don't see part of the answer would be in order to, I think, bring down inflation even, but in order for the economies to start growing consistently and to keep inflation low, this closed economy has to go away. Part of the reason why it's so close is, I would say, lobby power by existing industries that have been used not to compete. It's not the only reason, but all these regulations and exchange rate regimes also go against exporters. So there are many reasons why Argentina is so close, but definitely opening up is key going forward. Sequencing is very important, though.
I had a question concerning he wants to replace the pesos with the dollars. And firstly, do you think that it will stabilize the economic situation in the country? And will the Congress also be in favor of that? And also, what is the US position on that? And also, is it feasible? Because I don't really see how it is possible to achieve it given the current high inflation and the fact that everybody has pesos in the country, etc. So how such a currency transition would technically work?
That's a great question. So yes, that was one of his 4 big promises in campaign: dollarization and closing the central bank. When you look at the current situation, it's not feasible to do it. let me show you a few numbers that I had. I didn't show them due to lack of time, but I want to show you. There are different ways in which you can dollarize an economy. Basically, dollarize an economy that has its own currency means that all those pesos that are in people's pockets, in bank accounts, all of a sudden become dollars, okay? But to do so, you need dollars. And there are approximately, between currency in circulation and deposited pesos, there are like 61 billion pesos out there. And the central bank has now negative $4 billion. So with negative $4 billion, you cannot do it, okay? Not feasible. Now, let's assume for a second that the central bank is able to buy or to get a loan, and soon it gets $10 billion. With $10 billion, that's what I'm showing there, the exchange rate at which you can fully back all the pesos that are out there is at 6,000 pesos per dollar. The exchange rate now is approximately, the parallel exchange rate is 1,000 pesos per dollar. It's multiplying by 6. The exchange rate, that will bring a huge inflationary impact. So even if they manage to get like $15 billion more pretty quickly, to fully back the pesos would be tough. Now, one could argue, and that's true, that you don't need to fully back all peso deposit. If you back part of that, that could be enough. People will then believe that you have enough backing and leave the peso deposits in the bank. So this graph shows the following. With different, on the vertical axis is different amounts of deposit coverage with dollars of the pesos. And here is the exchange rate that you would get given under the big assumption that the central bank is able to buy $15 billion or to get $15 billion pretty quickly. And you see that, for example, if it decides to back only 25% of deposit, 24, the exchange rate would be 2,000, like again, doubling the exchange rate, a big jump in inflation again. If it decides to back 40% of the deposit, the exchange rate would be 3,000 pesos per dollar. If you want to dollarize at the current exchange rate of 1,000, if you get the $15 billion, you can only back 6% of the deposits. So for the time being, it's not feasible. Then there is a second discussion, which is whether this is a good idea or not. So what is the good part of dollarizing, if it's successful on this front, is that immediately, in a sense, you start very quickly, you start having the credibility of the issuer of the other currency. And therefore, your inflation comes down very quickly. Okay? Maybe after 2-3 months in which prices accommodate a little bit, you will start having very low inflation, like the US does, something like that. Okay, that's a good thing. What's the problem of dollarization? Is that we know that then economies are affected by shocks. And if the shocks that hit the US economy are very different from the shocks affecting the Argentine economy, you might end up having a completely wrong monetary policy. Let's say that the US is hit by a positive shock and inflation in the US start coming up, but the shock hit and Argentina is not affected by any shock. Then the Fed might increase interest rate at a time when Argentina wouldn't need that to happen. One thing is to share a common currency, as it happens in the EU, where all the countries have a seat at the board of the central bank, and to some extent have an opinion on monetary policy. Another one is just transferring your monetary policy to some other country. And the same applies to productivity shocks. No? As the US becomes more productive, if your country does not, your goods start becoming too expensive for the rest of the world. So I don't think that looking forward, dollarization is the best way for an economy like Argentina to go. When you look at the experience in the world, in general, it is very small countries that have dollarized, not a country of the size of Argentina. Now, my concern is that politically speaking, it might be tempting in the short run, because bringing down inflation very quickly, that would be a big hit politically. And the costs of that come later. In a sense, Argentina lived with a regime of that kind. Convertibility regime was in place in Argentina between 1991, following a hyperinflation, until 2001. Those 10 years, basically the peso was fixed to the dollar at the 1-to-1 parity, and the inflation was very low. But at some point, Brazil devalued. There were a couple of international shocks that affected the Argentine economy, and the economy started to stagnate, unemployment started to grow, and the fixed parity couldn't be maintained. I don't see why dollarization would end up in a different way. That's why I think that there has to be a stabilization plan that lowers inflation much faster than what this plan is trying to do, but I wouldn't advise to go through to dollarization on the economic front.
Thank you so much for the really interesting talk. The coalition with Cambiemos, about what political parties that are in this alliance, and also what people has Javier Milei surrounded himself with? What is his administration like? And then quickly, one last thing. Is it true that he cloned his dog?
That he what?
Did he clone his dog? Is this true?
Yes, it's true. That's an easy one. Yes, it's true. He has like 4 dogs that are supposed to be clones, yes, of his original dog. Yes. Yeah, yes. He's a special guy in many dimensions. Okay. So going to the question of the political parties, Cambiemos was a coalition made of, I would say, 4 parties, a large one, which was PRO, that is Macri's party. Then the Radical Party, remember the one that was the Social Democrats, and then 2 smaller parties. So Macri's party, PRO, is trying to support Milei's government in Congress. The other parties in that coalition are less supportive of his policy. Some are just saying no, and one of the small ones, the Radical Party, is saying sometimes yes, sometimes no. Then the other big party in opposition is the Peronist Party, which is still led by, to some extent, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, although she's not the president of the party, and she's one of the leaders, and they definitely are against the vast majority of Milei policies. The other important political force comes from the governors of the provinces. Most of them are Peronists. Some are more moderate than Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, and they are negotiating with the government. We'll see what happens. But that's the political landscape. In terms of the people that work with him, it's a mixture. So he has some people that were, for example, the current finance minister was at some point finance minister in the Macri's administration, and was my predecessor at the central bank during the Macri's administration. The governor of the central bank was also part of Macri's administration. They are able guys. The Minister of Security. The other key aspect was the presidential candidate from Cambiemos in this last election. I would say those are some of the key players. Then the political part is people that he has put on to deal with it. So far, in a very difficult environment, they have not been very successful. I would say that the biggest hitters so far have been, well, the economy, the finance minister, and the communication team he put together for the campaign, and that continues to help him, and that is working. The rest is people that are not that experienced, and they have not been able to achieve much. Again, it's not an easy situation, no? The economy is in a crisis. They don't have support in Congress, so we cannot blame them a lot.
So I think we're kind of out of time. So one last question. Yeah.
Just the microphone is, just hold on for the microphone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. No, it's fine. Thank you, Professor Sanleris. Very interesting and very insightful presentation that you gave us. So I have a question. You talked before about sustainability, and that is one of my concerns when I look at the macroeconomic policies of Milei, and is to say, so looking at the graph, we saw the high peaks. I would imagine like people in Argentina don't have a lot of savings because this is not a crisis of a couple of years, but of decades. Let's say tomorrow the Argentine economy comes to 1% of inflation. Market is perfect for consumers to go back into the market and get prices at a fair price. But what I'm concerned about is, one of the indicators that Argentina was doing very well with is unemployment. What 6%? I'm sure this percentage is increasing by now, way more, and it doesn't promise to get better because of the reduction of all these things. People is getting poorer and richer because of he's taking away all these subsidies to transport, pension, etc. So how do you think the government should do after, in the best, let's say, situation? How are consumers supposed to go back into that economy and make the economy function as it should when the money is just going to run out of their banks?
So it's a good question. So on the short run, these kind of policies are tough on people's pockets. No, we said real wages have fallen, the value of pensions has fallen. So these months are really tough. Now, the hope is that once inflation comes down, just having a little bit of stability should generate a positive impact on economic activity, by normalizing things. It's very hard to live in an economy with prices changing like crazy every month. But there is a transition period that is very difficult for everybody. And in a sense, if I have to summarize my message in this presentation, is Milei inherited an economy in crisis, in a big crisis, and that has for many years not done well. And trying to solve that requires some difficult policies to be implemented. And what I'm seeing in these first 100 days is that he's trying to implement those economic policies with some success. But 3 months or 100 days is a very short period of time to claim that you have gained the battle. It's just, if this is like a long term, and there are too matches that have been played so far. So with some success. And I think that key for his success is to be able to lower inflation faster and to moderate the output costs of doing so. Without that, I think he might run into trouble because his only support comes from being popular. And people's patience tends to evaporate, as you correctly described, when the economy is not going well. And for a while, it won't go well. So I think that's my summary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.